Greetings, everyone. This is Fahad Malaikah coming to you from Washington, D.C. with the third edition of the NESA Alumni Virtual Interview Series. Today, we are honored to be joined by a longtime NESA alumnus, Sharif Nasser bin Nasser from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Nasser is the managing director of the Middle East Scientific Institute for Security, or MESIS, which is an independent, non-government, non-profit organization based in Amman that works across the Middle East to address chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear risks. He is also a non-resident scholar at the Washington-based Middle East Institute. Nasser and I go back a number of years, and we first met through the NESA Center Strategic Studies Network, or SSN, which is a consortium of think tanks from the NESA region and beyond, and which proudly counts MESIS as a member institute. Nasser, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Today, our topic is regional organizational and system design for security governance. In our own conversations leading up to this interview, you have argued, especially amidst the COVID-19 crisis, that regional governments have certain practices and characteristics that impact their performance in security governance, and that really no one is sufficiently looking at this issue from this angle. So that brings me to my first question. What has the COVID crisis revealed about the system design and organizational cultural challenges that are facing governments in the Middle East or MENA region? Over to you.
First of all, thank you, Fahad, for that very kind introduction and for having me join you here in the speaker series. I have to just start by offering a disclaimer that the views that I express in my talk are my personal views. They don't represent those of any Jordanian or other agency. And I have to also preface by saying that I am generalizing a little bit. My comments aren't specific to any particular country in the region, but talking just broadly on trends and on what we've seen during this crisis and in the lead up to it. And in our conversation as well, what we had said was that every country, region, or organization has its own unique values, national psyche, and organizational culture that largely dictates their behavior, action, and performance within the system that they're operating in. And the Middle East is no different. Some examples I could share with you from a US context for your US audience from the corporate or public spheres could include from the corporate world, VW lying about their emissions tests a few years ago, or more recently, Boeing refusing to take responsibility for the 737 MAX crashes. So what is it about the organizational culture and values of these organizations and the systems in which they were operating, in this case, the automotive or aviation regulatory system that allowed for this to happen? If you were to ask me about something from the public sphere, I would say that the US public's reaction and response to the COVID crisis, the national psyche, which has been somewhat resistant to the restrictive measures or the preventative measures, has also been largely shaped by the evolution of the national psyche in the US post 9/11. During that time, the predominant thinking was that Americans didn't want to change their way of life. Otherwise, terrorism would be victorious. So Americans resumed their daily lives so as to defy the challenge and defy the threat and drive the point home that they would be undeterred by terrorism. And now they're having difficulty reconciling that with what's needed to effectively survive the COVID crisis, which is to stay at home and live in this constant climate of fear. I don't mean to make light of this situation at all, but it's just to illustrate some examples of how culture and organizational and national culture can shape our realities. So what has the COVID crisis revealed about the system design and organizational culture challenges in the region? some are specific to the regions and some are more universal. And I'm going to list a few with you, but I'm going to also preface by saying that I don't mean to be overly negative or critical of the region or the performance of any organizations in the region, but you did ask me for the challenges. So I don't want to come across as being Orientalist in my views. So to begin with, almost all the countries in the region had to overcome what was called a normalcy bias at the onset of the crisis, which essentially causes countries to underestimate both the possibility of such a widespread crisis and the impact that it could have. And this is because I think the region rarely plans for the worst case scenario. And when all the indications from climate change to unemployment to dwindling resources suggest that they should be making their plans based on worst case scenarios, they're not. And perhaps this is a result of some cultural fatalism of sorts, but it's very pronounced in the planning process. Two, I think there's a general tendency to consolidate decision making, especially during crises. Instead of consolidating this decision making, the proven approach to a successful approach has been to empower others, and that's not always happening across our region. Three, there's a tendency to avoid recognizing and admitting mistakes and adjusting the course of action accordingly, insisting that something is working when it's clearly not. And I think that might stem from maybe an aversion to talking openly about mistakes that have been committed in the decision-making process. Four, I think we have an over-reliance on security and military institutions to address anything that has a hint of security, whether that's the current biological threats that we're facing now through this COVID crisis, or whether it's things like radicalization and violent extremism. There's this tendency to throw anything that has a hint of security into the laps of security organizations, whereas what is really required is a whole of government approach that can tap into all the elements of national power. Five, I think this particular issue is not only relevant to the region, but it's a universal problem, which is there's a difficulty in finding an effective partnership between scientific and policy communities. How can science inform policymaking, and how can we make the science more accessible to decision makers in an understandable way? And I think this is something that a lot of people are grappling with, a lot of countries are grappling with, including the United States. Where is the scientific community informing decision making? And if we do look at the risks outside of the COVID context that we are facing globally, whether it's climate change or energy or what have you, most of these risks do have scientific dimensions and require scientific solutions as well. Sixth, I think if we look at our response in general like a three-legged stool, or look at our architecture like a three-legged stool comprising of people, processes, and technology, we have a tendency across our region to rush to solutions focusing on technology and equipment while avoiding the people and processes components. There's a good example that I can cite here from an unnamed country. A colleague was commenting that they're using very expensive PPP, physical protection equipment, for their medical sampling teams, but a lot of the personnel doing the sampling have full-grown beards, which would render the equipment useless. And so that's just a good example of how there's this rush to stock up on equipment and get the nice new shiny apps to do the contract tracing without looking at the underlying administrative requirements to support those capacities. I think maybe I'll stop there, Fahad.
Thank you, Nasser. Those are all great points. So I want to switch gears just a little bit, and by noting that in a recent interview with another alumnus from Bangladesh, he stated that COVID is the one phenomenon that truly brought together the countries of the South Asia region. How has this played out in the Arab world or Middle East? Has the crisis improved regional cooperation? Over to you.
That's a very interesting question, Fahad, and I wish I could say that it has fostered regional cooperation as much as our a colleague from Bangladesh has claimed. I think it's been a little bit mixed in our region, and that's because in our region, as it is elsewhere, the automatic reaction is to have more sort of protectionism and more inward looking. And I think that's a real shame because there are already so many lessons learned that could be shared across the region, especially given a lot of the cultural and cultural similarities. But I think there are some good signs that we can see here or there, whether it's sharing equipment or providing aid and assistance and relief where required. And ultimately, I think cross-border threats like COVID really require multilateral solutions. National solutions alone are insufficient to address them.
Thank you, Nasser. So for those from the United States watching, including our own stakeholders, how, if at all, can the United States support the region so that it can better address these organizational, culture, and system design challenges? Over to you.
Well, as you know, Fahad, the region has U.S. support to this region has been considerable and extensive over the years, and certainly appreciated. The U.S. is the primary security and economic partner for the region. I think the simple answer to your question is to continue with capacity building activities. But if I were to give it a lengthier response, I think it's time to really revisit some of the current business model, which simply throws money at problems and over relies on consultants and contractors for delivery, many of whom, certainly not all of them, aren't reliable. And this isn't a US specific problem, but it is a significant problem when we look at international assistance anywhere. So I think it's it's about time to approach capacity building with a little bit more empathy, maybe avoid cookie cutter approaches to address the region's complex problems. And the solutions ultimately, I think, have to be highly individualized and localized, which will in turn make them more sustainable. There's a great saying which goes something along the lines of, don't be solutions looking for problems to solve. And I think with a lot of the approach to capacity building across the region, there's this tendency to want to have a modular approach towards everything without really looking at the local context.
Thank you, Nasser. So to close us out, I want to kind of turn it back on you, and in particular, go back to one of the points you made about finding effective partnerships between science and policymakers. So tell us a little bit more about MESIS and its current work. And where does MESIS fit into this puzzle with its efforts on regional technical cooperation? Over to you.
So, as you know, Fahad, MESIS is a non-governmental organization and a non-profit as well. So I think we can approach these delicate security issues from a purely scientific and technical perspective, or an apolitical perspective, insofar as that's possible. What we try to do is simply promote best practices and exchange best practices and look at win-win formulations where we can help stabilize and secure the region. What we do in very broad terms is threefold. One is we try to promote this whole of government approach so that all parts of government are working effectively to address these chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear risks. Two, we try to find some regional cooperation wherever possible. And three, we try to infuse this very traditional security sector with some innovative thinking in terms of looking at new approaches to building capacity and exchanging best practices. We've been active on the COVID crisis. We've been active in doing a lot of related work on pandemic surveillance, on preparation for bio incidents, whether those are at refugee camps across the region or whether those are at facilities. We are very active in other areas as well. We've recently inaugurated a regional radiation detection training center, which is looking at offering training for frontline forces who are involved in the screening of cargo, who can detect contaminated, irradiated material, but also radioactive material that's out of regulatory control, that's being smuggled across borders for malicious or financial purposes. So I think the thing that we do and how we fit into this puzzle is we have to try to really find ways in which we can cooperate and coordinate and communicate. And it's mostly in functional areas where there's a win-win approach.
Nasser, you've really given us a lot to digest. This has been really helpful and we truly appreciate your time. I hope to be able to call upon you again in the future. We are proud to count you among our alumni ranks, and we are grateful to have had the chance to work with MESIS over the years, and we hope that our collaborative efforts can continue, and hopefully in person in the near future. So to everyone watching, stay safe, take care, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.